Our next speaker is Terryl Givens. And just on a personal note, before I read his bio, we have people who email and say, I want to read a book, just one book, that will help me deal with issues in anti-Mormonism and such. Which book should I read? And I recommend Terryl Givens, By the Hand of Mormon. And I think that's an excellent book. His other book that's on the back, on the speaker table back there, has not been released yet, apparently. We're the first ones to have that book, so you can go home and show all your neighbors that you have the book before anybody else does, kind of like the Harry Potter books, I suppose. But let me read his bio. Terryl Givens was born in upstate New York, just the other side of Finger Lakes from Palmyra, and graduated from Brigham Young University. He did his graduate work at Cornell and the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill in intellectual history and in comparative literature. He has published articles on Greek aesthetics, literary theory, and European Romanticism, in addition to books in religious studies, including Viper on the Hearth, By the Hand of Mormon, and People of Paradox, A History of Mormon Culture, released in July 2007. Dr. Givens' presentation is from a work in progress, or it's just now printed, When Souls Had Wings, Premortal Existence in Western Thought. Dr. Givens is currently Professor of Literature and Religion and holds the James Bostwick Chair of English at the University of Richmond, where he has been named a distinguished educator and teaches courses in 19th century studies. He's written several books. You can find them on the speaker's table, and we're very pleased to welcome Dr. Terryl Givens.
Well, it's wonderful to be here this morning. Thank you for the invitation. Mormons, I think, can be too quick to see all inspired texts written previously to 1830 as potential proof texts, to see Jesus' ministrations to Mary and Martha as foreshadowing the home teaching program, and every sunken Mesoamerican hole in the ground as a baptismal font. We are too quick, in other words, to see these other systems and phenomena as deriving their value in proportion to their capacity to anticipate a restoration that we treat as full and complete. It is not. Prophets from Joseph Smith and Brigham Young to President Kimball have reminded us of that. Today I want to show how my own appreciation for and understanding of the pre-existence has been enriched and broadened by a comparative study of the idea and its myriad appearances in the history of philosophy, theology, and literature. What I have come to appreciate is this cardinal insight. If the restoration is not yet complete, then other traditions have much to teach us, not by way of confirming, let me repeat that, not by way of confirming, corroborating, or verifying the truths we already have, but by way of actually adding to the body of revealed doctrine that we call precious and true. The restoration is neither full nor complete. Brigham once said in reference to the keys of resurrection, "This is one of the ordinances we cannot receive here, and there are many more. It will be a great while after you have passed through the veil," said Joseph, "before you will have learned all the principles of the gospel." What if, instead of scrambling frantically to find explanations when Joseph appears to have borrowed from the Masons or Ethan Smith or Tom Dick, we instead see another possibility of Joseph actually practicing what he preached? As Brigham characterized his position, if you can find a truth in heaven, earth, or hell, it belongs to our doctrine. We believe it. It is ours. We claim it. It takes real humility and generosity of spirit to be taught. Our contemporary condescension in this regard was clearly foreign to a prophet who showed the world he could translate gold plates written in Reformed Egyptian and then hired a Jewish schoolmaster to teach him Hebrew. So as a believing Latter-day Saint, what do I bring to the study of pre-existence? Not much. Only a very skeletal understanding of the principle as taught by Joseph. In some sense, my identity is eternal. And before I was born, I existed in a form that included the capacity to make decisions and covenants. Not much more than that. What is the value or the power of this spiritual anthropology? Well, it means that I am a child of God, an eternal being. But what other value and power might a belief such as this embody? What might its persistence over thousands of years and across cultures and religions and traditions reveal about myriad other questions, longings, yearnings, riddles, and dilemmas that this belief responds to? I sometimes feel that Mormonism has the answer, but doesn't know the question. So what have I learned in this regard? The sheer bulk of the names who have espoused or taught or contemplated the doctrine has been a little astonishing, from the early rabbis and church fathers to Robert Frost, and a recent Nobel Prize laureate. In the 19th century, the idea was promulgated by some of the most influential theologians and preachers of the day. The idea produced book-length treatments and book-length refutations. It occupied debaters at the Concord School of Philosophy and filled the pages of religious journals in antebellum America. It characterized whole schools of philosophy, from the Cambridge Platonists to the American Transcendentalists, and appears in lesser-known American and Russian philosophical treatments as well. It is associated with a number of European mystics and European philosophers, from Hume to Locke to Kant. Hardly a romantic poet did not wax eloquent in its defense. Wordsworth, only the best known to Latter-day Saints among many. The sheer volume and brilliance and earnestness and tragic contexts of many of the participants in this tradition awoke in me the suspicion that this is a doctrine whose stakes and appeal and potential for philosophical and cultural work we have not even begun to appreciate. By philosophical and cultural work, I mean to indicate the approach the philosopher Nietzsche so brilliantly exemplified in his Genealogy of Morals, when he asked not, what do we discover, when he asked, what do we discover if we don't ask, are the categories good and evil, soul and conscience true and transcendent, but rather if we ask, what function do these concepts serve historically? Whom and what do they benefit? What social and political dilemmas do they resolve? We seldom move beyond our excitement at finding reinforcement for our own truth claims to move to these interesting and vitally important questions. Latter-day Saints believe that the doctrine of preexistence was known to Abraham, and presumably earlier. In the West, at least, the idea is not attested to with any clarity before Plato, though there are tantalizing hints in Mesopotamian texts. And I'm going to turn to one of those now, an Akkadian poem written some 16 centuries before Christ, describes a council of gods convened to discuss the creation of man. To animate this new creature and make it capable of fulfilling tasks previously relegated to the gods, they resort to a drastic expedient. They sacrifice an entity called Way, because he is a god both divine and possessed of a spirit. Then they take of his blood and they pour it into the clay prototype that they have made, with the hope that this new creature called man will not recognize in himself his divine origins and thus aspire to be one of the gods. We see in this story both an important precursor to the idea of a human soul and a panoply of threads that will weave in and out of subsequent mythologies of that soul's origins and potential destiny. The very word human being in Akkadian is a composite of this name, Way, and the word for God or divine nature. In other words, language and myth alike suggest that it was thought necessary, in order to create this species called man, to have recourse to a divine entity possessed of a spirit, and to unite this pre-existent divine aspect with a mortal created shell. The council approved the plan, and the process of creation began. As one text summarizes, to leave the gods idle in this place of happiness, Marduk created man. The exact wording of what happens next establishes a precedent, not just for the kind of dualism familiar to us in the West, but for a creation of a spirit and body that come into existence at different times. Conception, says the text, occurs as a deposit of this divine substance into a human prototype. So all the seeds for subsequent philosophical elaboration and theological controversy regarding the anthropology of the human soul are here. The spirit of man is specifically invoked as that which distinguishes him from other varieties in the created order of things and makes him nearer to the gods than all other things. But the spark of divinity in his breast is simultaneously an invitation to theurgy or theosis, to seek out and return to his heavenly roots, even as it is a temptation to hubris, to step beyond his assigned link in the great chain of being and incur divine displeasure or even wrath. Sharing the very blood of the gods, man is both kin and threat. And the deposit that inaugurates life and guarantees immortality precedes that life, having its origin in the heavens among the gods themselves. This is, I believe, a terribly important text, and it is at least the earliest indication that I have found in my studies of the seeds of what we will come to call the human soul and the concept of pre-existence. The Council of the Gods, a common motif in Mesopotamian texts, will pass into the Ugaritic tradition and survive clearly in Hebraic religious texts. Eventually, in at least two traditions, human souls will even appear not as simple products of the deliberations of that council, but as actual participants in those councils. As you know, traces of the assembly of gods motif is apparent in the Old Testament, as are intimations of pre-existence and foreordination of particular figures and lineages. Meanwhile, in these pre-Christian centuries, Greece has become a hotbed of what may be an independent center for the development of this idea. Plato's theory of pre-existence is the best known and most influential. But there are many and various ideas in the Hellenic world, so many, in fact, that Plato's student Aristotle decides in the 4th century that it is time to take stock of them and evaluate their merits. So we have this interesting text from Aristotle in which he gives us a picture of a Hellenic world that is energetically divided among a number of competing conceptions about where the human soul originates. Aristotle passes them all through the filter of his Attic reasonableness and judges most of them deficient. Here is what he writes. The view we have just been examining, in company with most theories about the soul, involves the following absurdity: that they all join the soul to the body without explaining the reason for their union. So it's not the idea that is absurd to him, but the lack of a rationale behind it. A different objection, he says, lies against the view expressed in the Orphic poems. There it is said that the soul comes in when breathing takes place. The problem with this, he says, is that some animals don't breathe, so how can they have souls? By the time of Christ, in other words, ideas about pre-existence are commonplace throughout the ancient world. The Mediterranean in the early Christian centuries is a very cosmopolitan place. The Hebrews, the Pythagoreans, the Orphics, the Platonists, the Stoics, and a slew of Eastern influences all feed into this mix and all contribute myths, texts, and doctrines involving premortal existence of some kind. So much so that lines of transmission and influence become hopelessly intertwined and confused. So I'm going to pass over that voluminous and fascinating material to jump ahead to a moment when the Christian church begins to try to sort out in systematic fashion just what the standing of these ideas is. By the time of Augustine of Hippo, or St. Augustine, one of the most influential thinkers since Paul, there are 4 competing theories for the soul's origin, and this comes from Aristotle's own treatise in which he describes these 4 and evaluates their merits. Did I say Aristotle? St. Augustine. The first is called traducianism, and in this theory he says souls come into being by propagation. In other words, the parents, when they unite intimately, they produce not just a physical offspring, they also produce another human soul to inhabit that offspring. The second theory is creationism, that each soul is created individually for each person who is born. But notice that he has 2 additional theories, and both of them are theories of a pre-existent soul. One in which the soul is compelled to come to earth, one in which the soul chooses to come to earth. If a little visual imagery helps you, this is the theory of traducianism. that God created the first man and soul, but after that, it is the man and woman that produce each subsequent generation. Creationism, God creates each and every soul. Every time there's an act of conception, God is there to create the human spirit. In the third and fourth theories, we have this beautiful image almost of spirits descending from heaven like rain every time there is the physical generation of a body. Now, St. Augustine notes in his commentary, he says, the commentators on Scripture have not solved or shed any light on this perplexing question of the soul's origin. So by the 4th century AD, there still isn't any hard and fast official church teaching on this subject. Now, there would have been very good reasons to believe, given the doctrinal maelstrom that was the early 5th century, that one version or the other of pre-existence would emerge as a victor in this contest for successful spiritual genealogy. Here's why. Unfolding at this time in the Christian church are a number of pressing controversies that touch on matters of essential human identity and human nature. Humankind's role in and responsibility for sin, God's justice, the meaning and scope of grace. All these and more are contingent on the theory of the soul and its origin. And as St. Augustine suggests, the Scriptures leave this matter unsettled. And traducianism and creationism are both so fraught with logical and theological problems that it is miraculous that pre-existence ever lost out. In fact, today Orthodox Christian theologians continue to debate whether traducianism or creationism is the least problematic. For traducianism, you see, requires that to men and women is given this capacity to generate a human soul. That is a prerogative most would reserve only to God. As a consequence, Lutherans are about the only people today who subscribe to traducianism. Creationism, on the other hand, requires that we hold not only that God is continuously involved in millions and millions of instances of spirit creation, but it raises this dilemma. How can a spirit that comes fresh from God's own hand have, as part of its makeup, the taint of original sin? Another reason to choose pre-existence over these other theories, which is St. Augustine's preference, is that Augustine cannot resist the appeal of a theory that solves the question of God's apparent injustice. As he writes, if instead the souls that have been created elsewhere are not sent by the Lord God, but come to inhabit bodies of their own choice, it is quite easy to see that the ignorance and difficulty that result from their own wills cannot be blamed on their Creator, since He is without fault. In other words, if we choose to inhabit this mortal sphere, then we cannot blame God for the circumstances in which we find ourselves. Finally, the idea had the support of the most respected theologian and church father of his era, Origen, who wrote, everyone, therefore, of those who descend to the earth is according to his deserts or to the position that he had there, ordained to be in this world, either in a different place or in a different nation or in a different occupation. So Origen was by far the most vigorous proponent of this idea of pre-existence and influenced many of the other church fathers in this regard. My time is half over, so I'm going to just skip about 1,000 years. And I want to just survey, just very briefly, a kind of sampling of what I have found to be some of the more interesting arguments that have been raised in the ensuing centuries to support, defend, or resurrect this doctrine of premortal existence. It's officially condemned by the Catholic Church in the 6th century, or the early Christian Church, but it never, ever, ever disappears. That's one of the most amazing discoveries of this study that I've been embarked upon, is that there is this dogged persistence of this idea that maintains itself intact in a variety of traditions through all these intervening centuries. But let me just show you some of the more interesting examples. I recently heard of an acquaintance of mine who left the church, and the explanation that filtered down to me was that it had something to do with the gospel's inability to satisfy him aesthetically. Now, that may strike some people as curious or trivial or absurd. It strikes me as one of the best reasons I've ever heard. I mean only that beauty is a valid criterion for our acceptance of the gospel, not that it was correctly applied in this case. After all, we are commanded to worship the Lord in the beauty of holiness. And the psalmist wrote devotedly, "One thing I have desired of the Lord, that will I seek after, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to behold the beauty of the Lord." So I found it particularly compelling when the influential contemporary religious scholar D.P. Walker pointed out when he pointed out that the normative Christian conception of eternity is seriously lacking aesthetically. It exhibits, he says, arbitrary and asymmetrical features. He writes, "Christians are perhaps at a real disadvantage in having two eternities, the heaven and hell inhabited by humans, which have a beginning but no end. Why not an eternitas aparte ante instead of post? In other words, why not beings who have no beginning but an end? Or why not both? Or why not a successive eternity with neither beginning nor end?" He says, to anyone thinking in Platonic terms, the eternity without end would seem highly paradoxical. It's truncated, lopsided, and would be absurdly inadequate to an image of the ideal still eternity. The Christian scheme is untidy and inelegant. But then he goes on to discuss the resurrection of the idea of pre-existence in Platonic terms in the 17th century. And he said it was aesthetics that played an important part. And he says this quite approvingly. The problem with conventional Christian models may be aesthetic, but their implications are logically troubling as well. For the orthodox rendering of an asymmetrical eternity retains, he writes, a disadvantage common to all Christian schemes as compared with the Neoplatonic one. It leads to the basic unanswerable question, why did God create it all? In the Platonic scheme, he says the question never arises. So what we have is this beautifully elegant, continuous eternity. There is a temporary descent into mortality, a time of probation, and then a reascent back into the stream of eternity. Beautiful, lovely, and entirely intuitive, he writes. The primary impetus behind pre-existence, as far as I can make out, is certainly not aesthetics. It's not the shadowy intimations of a Wordsworth or the epistemological quandaries of a Plato. Plato comes to the problem largely by asking the question, how is it that we know things that we shouldn't know? And pre-existence provides an answer. The most compelling impetus behind the idea seems to be the drive for theodicy, right? Theodicy, by which is meant the attempt to make sense of the justice of God, given the conditions of mortality we see. Even Plato himself argued in the Republic that the premortality of a soul endowed with choice means we cannot blame God for our mortal condition. Origen's famous espousal of preexistence was absolutely predicated on the conception of a human fall that we all participate in. St. Augustine, as we saw, also found this a powerful attraction. But the most radical and influential resurrection of both theodicy and preexistence occurs in the 19th century, not at the hands of Joseph Smith, but by a man who was at one time the most promising member of the mid-19th century's most prominent American family, the Beechers. His father, Lyman, and his brother, Charles, were commanding figures in that era, probably the two most popular, famous, influential preachers of the era. One sister achieved fame as a suffragist, the other as the little lady who started a war, Harriet Beecher Stowe. But it was Edward who some family members thought had the most promise. Why hasn't anybody heard of Edward Beecher? Well, the explanation is succinct and poignant, and it's given by a descendant as he handed over to Illinois State College Library a manuscript life of Edward Beecher, and he attached this note. I am about to send on to you the last manuscript, Life of Edward Beecher, by his brother Charles. It is none too rich in human interest, perhaps being concerned overwhelmingly with Edward's spiritual development and his belief in the pre-existence of the soul. An unfortunate excursion into the realms of heresy, which apparently wrecked his career. And then he adds this thought. He said, Edward Beecher apparently became obsessed with the idea and developed the delusion that he was born to be the Copernicus of morals. Well, he ended up being the Galileo instead. But his impassioned critique of Christian notions of depravity, of original sin, and of God's tyrannical caprice is a moving testament, I think, to the better nature of so many people in that age of reform. That Joseph Smith came to similar conclusions through prophecy rather than theology may deprive us of an appreciation for the majesty of the doctrine's moral power and of the philosophical and theological bases that people like Edward Beecher have erected under it. Beecher recorded this struggle he had with God. Pain, sickness, and death come to the human race antecedent to the development of reason. Such a constitution resembles punishment. But calling total depravity voluntary is like removing a difficulty by language only. In short, original, native, entire depravity is a hard doctrine to be explained. The question is not the present Christian system a malevolent one? This spoken by, as I said, a preacher and son of the most influential preachers of the mid-19th century. We cannot analyze the thing, he said. He continued to seek a resolution, and when he found it, it came as a virtual revelation. After his figurative groping, as his brother wrote, in some vast cathedral in the gloom of midnight, vainly striving to comprehend its parts and relations, when suddenly before the vast arched window of the nave, a glorious sun suddenly burst forth. What happened, in other words, was that Edward Beecher had a vision. He had an epiphany. It was a shattering epiphany that he wanted to share at once with his congregation and the world, but his cautious father urged restraint, saying it would wreck his career. Beecher kept the revelation to himself for a quarter of a century. Then he threw caution to the wind and issued a 400-page manifesto, the boldest and most detailed exposition of the doctrine of preexistence in religious history. Why haven't we heard of it? It was published in 1853 and called Conflict of Ages, or the Great Debate on the Moral Relations of God and Man. In it, he boldly asserted, God in the beginning created a race of spirit beings. These he constituted free agents and dealt by them in all things justly and honorably. His book landed like a bombshell. Most amazingly, reviewers almost universally agreed, quote, it presents the scriptural doctrine concerning the kingdom of fallen spirits in a light that is rational, intelligible, and impressive. Another reviewer wrote, Dr. Beecher's Conflict of Ages has been honored with a remarkable degree of attention. It has been reviewed and re-reviewed in newspapers, magazines, courses of lectures, in book form. It seems to have come down on pulpit and religious press like rain upon mown grass, as showers that water the earth in time of drought. The crop has been abundant. Still, the weight of tradition and prejudice overwhelmed both the book and the man. The philosopher Immanuel Kant seems to have been the first to find this unique argument in favor of preexistence. He felt that there was a startling incongruity between the triviality, the banality, and the utter contingency of circumstances under which most human life is conceived, and the product thereby engendered, which is something majestic, touched with divinity, and endowed with immortality. He wrote, the contingency of conception depends upon opportunity. But besides this, on nourishment, government, moods, caprices, or as we would say today, hormones, even on vices, it presents a great difficulty for the opinion that the soul has eternal duration, if it came into existence under circumstances so trivial. Or as he will conclude with gentle understatement, it certainly seems questionable to expect such a powerful effect from such inconsequential causes. Against this, however, you could propose a transcendental hypothesis, he wrote, that all has neither begun at birth nor will end through death. That if we could intuit the things and ourselves as they are, we would see ourselves in a world of spirit natures with which our only true community had not begun with birth. The Russian philosopher Nikolai Berdyaev, likewise, he was early 20th century, likewise found preexistence a powerful remedy to alternative anthropologies that deprive the human soul of its due dignity. Protestantism, he says, was bound to make its appearance because there existed in the history of Christianity no positive religious anthropology. But even this vacancy was filled by a false anthropology, he wrote. He would become probably the most impassioned philosophical defender of preexistence in the 20th century. He believed it was the most powerful means of recuperating a dignity that had been denied by Orthodox Christianity. If time permitted, I would talk to you about Wilhelm Benecke and his insight that preexistence is a necessary foundation for any claim to the intuition of spiritual realities. It's a very interesting argument. Essentially, he's referring to the same problem that a transcendent God has always posed. If God is truly ontologically distinct from us, exists outside of human space and time, how can he ever bridge that divide and communicate with us and become a part of human history and layers of being? And similarly, Benecke says, well, he agrees with that critique and says the only way that we could have a recognition of spiritual realities is if we are possessed of a spirit that comes from God's presence. I would talk to you about the transcendentalists' use of preexistence to assert a new kind of authoritative discourse, right? When Emerson and other American transcendentalists move away from traditional bases of authority and normative Christianity, they need nonetheless a way of founding their own authority as secular prophets. And they seem to do this time and time again by invoking this concept of a preexistence from which they themselves and all of us hark. I would talk about Julius Müller, a great 19th century theologian who wrote 2 volumes on the doctrine of sin, arguing that preexistence is the only way to save the concept of human agency. Or we could talk about the modern philosopher John McTaggart, very influential in his theories of temporality and time. And he invokes an argument that really is as old as Aristotle, that whatever is free is accountable, but only that which is cause of itself can be free. And therefore, only if the soul is self-existent and does not come into existence with the body, can you ground the idea of human freedom. But what all of these thinkers have in common is not simple reaffirmation of a truth taught by Joseph Smith in relative nakedness and simplicity, but a very real power to expand and enrich our understanding of what we hold to be an eternal truth, and a stunning witness to the immense variety of theological, cultural, psychological, and philosophical work that the paradigm has been invoked to serve across the centuries. Let me conclude with a few observations on what I think I have learned about the demise of preexistence. One scholar has this to say, modern scholar talking about the early Neoplatonic Christian bishop Synesius, who was an earnest advocate of preexistence. In fact, he agreed to be ordained a bishop only on the condition that he be allowed to maintain intact his affirmation of preexistence. Modern scholar says his affirmation of the inherent divinity, listen carefully to this little argument, Synesius' affirmation of the inherent divinity of the human soul, which makes it possible to return to the divine, is a clear indication of its essentially pagan faith. That's a somewhat astonishing and revealing claim. The best illustration this scholar can cite of his claim that the bishop's belief is pagan is when he quotes the bishop as saying, "The blessed one who flees the devouring bark of matter and earth rises up and with a leap of the Spirit presses on his path back to God." Surely this sounds as much like any medieval mystic as it suggests a pagan. What then is it that is so threateningly pagan about preexistence and human origination in the divine? The answer was given long ago by the church father Tertullian, when he, like our modern scholar, revealed how drastically the construction of Christianity's God was moving away from Plato's definition of God. In the Demise, Plato had written, "God was good, and the good can never have any jealousy of anything." Being free from jealousy, God desired that all things should be like himself. But Tertullian objected to this, saying, "To endow mankind with so large an amount of divine quality is to put it on a par with God. Plato makes it unborn. He then adds that the soul is immortal, incorporeal. Since he believes God to be the same, invisible, incapable of delineation, uniform, supreme, rational, what more could he attribute to the soul if he wanted to call it God? We, however, writes Tertullian, who allow no appendage to God in the sense of equality, by this very fact reckon the soul very far below God. We suppose that it was born. This, then, is how I perceive the demise of preexistence. This is a summation of a very long and complex history. With a centering of grace in Christian theology, which occurs in the early 5th century, it becomes a specially dispensed gift that precluded most, if not all, human capacity to lift the self. With a focus on sin, inherited guilt, and depravity, in the face especially of the Pelagian heresy, divine sparks to human nature, heavenly antecedents to the human personality were anathema. With creation ex nihilo, which develops only with time, a further necessary precondition of God's sovereignty, preexistence was increasingly seen as logically incompatible. If the sovereignty of God is defined as him being the source of all existence, then obviously souls cannot coexist with him. The coup de grace, however, occurs when St. Augustine determines that the concomitant to grace is a supra-rational logic beyond the human. The theodicy, right? The attempt to make sense of God's justice that St. Augustine had been so intent on establishing was made to bow to the mysterious workings of God. Rational resolution of the scandal of human pain and misery no longer required our attention or effort. In fact, in post-Augustinian thought, our perplexity in the absence of any logical understanding of God becomes a sign of our abject humility and of God's radically other sovereignty. What this means is that the powerful engine that had persistently urged a resolution of the problem of God's justice has just run out of gas. Human agency, so essential to human guilt, is no longer the desperately sought Holy Grail it once was, now that God's justice resolves itself out of the orbit of human understanding and apologias. For all these reasons, preexistence lost its most powerful allure. Centuries later, when human possibilities found exuberant expression alongside Neoplatonic resurgence, the idea gained a new foothold in the 17th century. Later again, when the 19th century, the age of reform, was ushered in with a new social conscience and a less powerful and less medieval church, poets and intellectuals again turned to plumb the depths of Faustian yearning, free of all imaginative constraints, and the idea of preexistence blossomed once more. Finally, let me say this. Noting the Pythagorean belief in preexistence at the foundations of Western civilization, a Cambridge classical scholar writes this: however many readers believe their soul will survive death, rather few, I imagine, believe that it also preexisted their birth. The religions that have shaped Western culture are so inhospitable to the idea of preexistence that you probably reject the thought out of hand, for no good reason. Of course, he then points out slyly, the same Pythagoras that taught the premortality of the soul also taught his followers to spit on their nail and hair clippings, to wash the left foot before the first, and that the sea consists of the tears of Cronus. Well, that may be true. Unfortunately, it misses the point that some beliefs meet a demise as definitive as their implausibility. And yet the critics of preexistence for hundreds of years have found little to criticize in the doctrine other than its hint of a family resemblance between ourselves and the God who gave us life. I will end with one of those critics whose argument does more to undermine himself than his target. The commentator in the Interpreter's Bible says this: there is something majestic in this conception of a fundamental justice woven into the very web of life, running through all things, working itself out in everything that happens to us. Yet surely it is much too crude and easy a solution. The doctrine of preexistence has persisted with astonishing tenacity across millennia and culture, a tribute itself, if not to its truth, then to its powerful capacity to satisfy logical, moral, and even aesthetic imperatives of the human heart. Preexistence, for that reason, may yet have a very bright future. Thank you. And the science. Okay, thank you. Well, give me just a minute to look through some of these. I'm trying to find the ones that my wife and I practiced. I'll take an easy one first. Pre-existence. Is this not problematical in that how can something exist before it exists? Yes. Strictly speaking, a literalist would say that the expression pre-existence is an impossibility. However, in the discourse of philosophy, the term has been considered an acceptable surrogate for the longer expression pre-mortal existence. So there is precedent for that. Could you elaborate somewhat on the relationship of the emergence of grace to the death of pre-existence? Yes, I maybe just a very little bit I can do this. I do discuss this at length in the book. But a couple of factors enter into it here. First of all is the Pelagian threat. Pelagius comes down to North Africa at the time that St. Augustine is trying to work through this doctrine of pre-existence and is still obviously very much attached to it. The Pelagian threat, of course, is the notion that there is no such thing as original sin. Well, along with the rejection of original sin, the Pelagians also asserted that man therefore has no need of atonement, and so man can essentially elevate himself to the status of a god. St. Augustine's position was that the doctrine of pre-existence solves the problem of original sin, in part because we can consider ourselves accountable for our very existence here on the earth. But he seemed to recognize that the doctrine of pre-existence was so closely aligned to this notion that there is a kinship between the human and the divine, that it lent support to the Pelagian attitude about sinfulness and human nature and seemed to render grace irrelevant or unnecessary. And so St. Augustine seems, for that reason, to have turned away from pre-existence in order to affirm the central necessity of grace and atonement to overcome man's sinful nature. Okay, I hope that makes some sense. Has any of your research dealt with Eastern philosophies, et cetera, et cetera? Eastern conceptions of pre-existence are, of course, much more common even than we find them in the West. And so simply in the interests of practicality, I had to say at the very outset of my study, I'm not going to deal with Eastern versions of pre-existence. I also separate it from the concept of metempsychosis or transmigration of souls or reincarnation. Those doctrines often are found closely aligned and intertwined, but not always. And so it is possible to treat them as separate ideas and separate traditions. By the way, that's one reason, one of the many reasons, and there's a list of 6 or 8 reasons why pre-existence does die out, why it is considered to be hostile to Christian orthodoxy. And one of those is because it is so frequently found in conjunction with reincarnation. And I think it's Paul who says it is given unto man once to die. So while the Bible doesn't, in fact the Bible could be said to have more support for it than opposition to pre-existence, but it does seem to speak specifically against reincarnation. And so what seems to have happened here is that you threw out the baby with the bathwater. You get rid of pre-existence, you don't have to worry about reincarnation, right? Another reason why pre-existence dies out is because the greatest threat, faced by the early Christian church, we know this because almost all of the early church fathers are writing against the Gnostics. And the Gnostics had a very fully developed theory of the pre-existence of the human soul. And so there again, in order to shut down Gnosticism, you shut down those doctrines most closely associated with it. Okay? Could some of your sources be considered what some may call the relics of Christianity, or the gospel as given to Adam, Enoch, Abraham? Do you understand the question? Read it again. Could some of your sources be considered what some may call the relics of Christianity, or the gospel as given to Adam, Enoch, Abraham, etc.? Well, this represents a very interesting methodological problem for a Mormon scholar, right? In what sense can we consider the writings contained in the Book of Abraham, for example, as a source? Well, I'll say a little bit about how I treat the Book of Abraham. From a Latter-day Saint perspective, I accept the Book of Abraham as an inspired text. I believe in the gospel as taught anciently to Adam and in all dispensations since. What that does is that gives me a particular vantage point. I can't, in the world of academic discourse, I can't invoke the Book of Abraham as an ancient text, but I can use it to condition my own set of beliefs about where I might look to find the origins. And in fact, that's exactly what I did. The reason why I turned to Mesopotamian sources was because I believed that if this tradition really does derive from Abraham and feeds into the Hebraic tradition, then there have to be antecedents there in the ancient world. And it was by doggedly persisting in this view that I eventually found some of those Mesopotamian texts that I think, if they don't clearly indicate preexistence, they seem to foreshadow it. So, there is a belief prominent in the academic world, of course, that we all have to engage in objectivity and methodological atheism. But the fact of the matter is there is no such thing as objectivity. Hans-Georg Gadamer, the great philosopher, said prejudice is the first step to knowledge. It's just that we all have a different prejudice. And the point isn't to be objective or unprejudiced. The point is to argue your case fairly and accurately. And so that's what I think we have to do as Latter-day Saint scholars. Let me see. Do you know whether Thomas Aquinas took a position on pre-mortal existence? I like questions that I can answer with one word. No, I don't know. I haven't gotten there yet, but I'm assuming that he would probably say something authoritative and definitive against the doctrine, because it's been completely anathematized twice in the Catholic Church by that point in time. The only place where the doctrine continues to rear its head is in the Eastern Orthodox Church. It's very interesting. If you go to the website of the Eastern Orthodox Church, you will find just diatribes against preexistence. And I remember the first time I encountered these, I was wondering, why go to the trouble? Why does this seem to be this hovering threat? Well, it turns out it's because this great philosopher, Nikolai Berdyaev, was Eastern Orthodox. And he is such a commanding, towering presence in early Russian philosophy and in the tradition of Orthodox thought that it's seen necessary to rebut him because he seems to pose such a potent threat by virtue of the strength of his arguments. Okay. Am I out of time? I think I'm out of time. And the four theories, last question. The four theories presuppose a dual nature of man. How prevalent is this dualist perception? Among present-day Christians, well, I assume it's quasi-universal. The interesting thing about the existence of the soul is we just take that as a given, and we often take it for granted in historical research. And one problem with a study of this nature is what do you mean by pre-existence first, and what do you mean by pre-existence of the human soul second? There's some very interesting passages in ancient Greek literature where you see, in the Iliad and the Odyssey, and you see these heroes descend into the underworld, right, to visit the world of shades. And what is clearly revealed in this literature from this pre-Hellenic period is that they didn't have a concept of human personality surviving death. There's just some kind of very sad vestigial remnant of the self. It's between the 8th century BC and the 4th century BC, by the time we get to Plato, that the modern conception of the soul as the seat of personality, self-consciousness, etc., agency, is developed. And it hasn't changed much since. Thank you very much.